Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing Game 3 of the regular season as the Sharks took on the St. Louis Blues. Now, it's not every day that a team scores 4 goals and ends up losing it, but with the fact that the Sharks have let in 5 goals in each of the past 2 games, the Sharks lose this game 5-4. And this one started off rather promising, at the very least on the scoreboard for the San Jose Sharks, as once again they were the team to score the first goal in the game. That was Kevin Labanc, and they would follow that up with a Logan Couture goal to make it 2-0, and that would be the final score at the end of the first period. And so while it wasn't a period that the Sharks dominated, it was quite similar to the first period that they played against the Coyotes in Game 1, where a couple of quick strike offensive goals, one on the power play included, managed to put them up 2-0. But similarly to how that second period went against the Coyotes, or at least how the rest of the game went against the Coyotes in that first game, the Blues stormed back. They would get early goals in the second period from both Falk and from Hoffman to tie it up at 2. And then while the Sharks would be able to make it 3-2 with a goal from Brent Burns also on the power play, the Blues would once again tie it up with a Braden Shen goal. And then, for the cherry on top, the Blues would take their first lead of the game with another Justin Falk goal near the end of the second period. And so, after the Sharks were leading 2-0 after 20, they were trailing 4-3 after 40. Come third period, the Sharks would tie the game, and they'd get a second goal from Logan Couture at that. But Jordan Kyrou would make it 5-4 a few minutes later, and that would be the final score of the game. The Sharks, as I said, scoring 4. You don't see a lot of teams lose scoring 4, but they end up letting in 5. First thing to talk about would be Devan Dubnyk, as he gets his first game started for the San Jose Sharks, and things started off rather promising for him. He wasn't tasked with making spectacular saves in the first period, but he was tasked with making many of them, and he came up quite big in that first period at that. There was, a couple of tough ones, like on a 2-1-1, and Dubnyk was up for the challenge, so it looked as though, he would be the starter for the following game on Wednesday against the St. Louis Blues. Maybe he's a better option, a better go-to than Martin Jones, but in the end, he ends up having a similar problem to what Jones had in the second game of the season against the Arizona Coyotes, where none of these goals were particularly Dubnyk's fault, but a couple of them were stoppable shots, let's say the Kyrou goal or Justin Falk's first goal, and unfortunately, Dubnyk just not really coming up with the big saves in those points, and he lets up 5 goals here tonight. Will Dubnyk get the start on Wednesday? It's possible, because it's not as though Martin Jones has necessarily outperformed him, but I would say it's probably going to be Jones back in between the pipes on Wednesday for this next game against the St. Louis Blues for this 2-game series. Next, I will be talking about both Donato and John Leonard, as of course, these two players are somewhat attached to each other in that coming into this season, the Sharks had that empty spot in their top 6, and it seemed pretty much reserved for Donato at the very least, but Leonard had a strong training camp, and Donato found himself a home on the third line, and so Leonard has been on that second line for the first 3 games, or at least most of the first 3 games, because at some point here later, in this game, around maybe the second or third period, the Bob Booner, head coach of the Sharks, decided to change up the lines. Handemark was moved up to the third line. Leonard was moved down to the fourth line with Sorensen and Marlowe. Then Meyer was put with Kane and Hurdle, and it was Donato put with Couture and Labanc. Will these be lines that stick for the following game? Maybe not the bottom 6, but potentially the top 6. I have found that while Leonard, of course, had those 2 assists in that first game, that it feels as though Donato does have a bit more potential to make things happen in that top 6 compared to Leonard. No offense to Leonard, of course, but he doesn't necessarily have that extreme offensive instinct. He is a good player, and of course he is still very young, so who's to say that, at some point later on this year, or at the very least in the next couple of years, he really develops further in that part of his game. But right now, I feel as though Donato is the slightly better option in the top 6, so I would like to see that stick potentially. As I said, the top 6 will likely change a lot. There's been, I've said a lot about the rotating sort of carousel for that 6th defenseman, but there also has been a carousel for that 4th line center spot. Game 1, it was Shellman. Game 2, it was Nason. Game 3 here was Handemark. I don't think any of those 3 players have necessarily had any sort of standout game, so it'll be interesting to see how the lines develop come Wednesday. Next, I will be talking about Brent Burns. So a lot has been said about the Sharks' defense in these first couple of games, now first 3 games of this season. And I've seen a lot of people, when there's saying bad things about, let's say, Erik Karlsson playing poorly defensively. They're sort of lumping in Brent Burns with that. I personally haven't thought that Brent Burns has been terrible through these first few games of this season, at least not as bad as Karlsson has been at times. Brent Burns has been slightly better than Erik Karlsson, I must say, and tonight I don't think was any different. Burns does get his first couple of points here tonight with a very nice goal, as well as a solid assist, and just in general, his defensive play really hasn't been all that terrible, I would say. I mean, that's not necessarily a fantastic compliment. Obviously, when you say a defenseman's defensive play hasn't been terrible, you normally want to say that it's been good, and I can't go so far as to say that for Brent Burns just yet, but I will say there have been worse players on the Sharks, and getting to that, it is Erik Karlsson, the inconsistent player himself. It's actually so difficult to watch Erik Karlsson play, not because he's just terrible at all moments of the game, but just because he has such high highs and such massive lows. On this goal that ended up which goal was this? Maybe the third or fourth goal. I'm not entirely. I think it was the fourth goal, actually. Erik Karlsson just gets beat wide by Jordan Kyrou. It just seems as though and this is not the first time that's happened just in these first 3 games of the season. Erik Karlsson just doesn't really necessarily have the speed to keep up with players who try to go wide on him when Karlsson is skating backwards. And there were also a couple of other plays throughout this game in the defensive zone that just seemed quite lazy from Erik Karlsson, which is something that has sort of been on brand for Karlsson since he arrived to the San Jose Sharks. But on the other hand, there have been some exceptional offensive plays, offensive tries by Erik Karlsson. There was one shift in particular where he had just insane vision to go for multiple passes that I don't think I've seen any player on the Sharks make since maybe Prime Thornton many years ago. And yet Erik Karlsson had the sort of the awareness and the vision to try and go for those passes. Now, they didn't actually end up connecting most of the time. It just feels as though Erik Karlsson is on somewhat of a different page offensively than many of the other Sharks players. I don't know if that's a criticism of Karlsson compared to just a criticism of the team itself not working with Karlsson. But it just goes to show that there are still those, there is still that fire in Erik Karlsson to make those incredible offensive plays, the fire that really made people regard him as one of the top players in the National Hockey League and one of the best defensemen, if not the best defenseman in the league just a few years ago. But it just... The pieces just aren't really fitting together at the moment for Karlsson and the San Jose Sharks, and so it continues to be quite frustrating to watch number 65 play. I don't think it takes a genius or it takes a professor to deduce that this $11.5 million contract that the Sharks are going to be giving him for the next 6 years, not including this one, is a bad deal. But, there are potential pieces, just to be optimistic here. There is the potential that these pieces somehow end up fitting together at some point and Erik Karlsson clicks again as a player. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's technically possible. And tonight I saw the signs that there is still something there from Karlsson. But that will do it for this review. As I said, the Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday once again against the St. Louis Blues. They didn't play particularly well here tonight, even though this game was rather close. And we'll see if they can put up a bit more of a consistent performance, and we'll see if their goaltenders and defense can clean things up. And the Sharks will try and get their second win of the season then. Class dismissed.